Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one the Russians have managed to advance further alongside the Usk river line, capturing another village. The Russians managed to capture the remaining parts of Dachne, and the Ukrainians have initiated a new counterattack in the Kursk region to secure the southern flank of Sucha. Starting out in the Kursk direction, we see that the Ukrainians managed to capture Cherkasskaya Konopelka, Fanasivka, and the forest lines alongside these advances. The Ukrainians launched a battalion-sized attack where they rushed these settlements with armored vehicles, mine-clearing vehicles, tanks, and infantry carriers. All of this to capture these towns and drop off infantry both within the forest patches, forest lines, and villages. The fighting continues in the direction of Ulanok as well as Ruskaya Konopelka, where the Ukrainians are attempting to gain control over those towns as well. The objective of the Ukrainians is to secure the southern and eastern flank of Sucha, and also to flank the current Russian flanking forces that are attempting to cut off the connection between Sucha and Ukraine itself, and through this they would need to gain control over these two towns and then push across the Sel river line and into Plechovo, where they will fight over that town yet again. The objective of the Ukrainians would be to cut off the supply lines for the Russian forces operating within Koridovka and Guevo on the western bank of the Sel river, and to regain control over Plechovo. Through this, the Russians are also being pushed back from Ruskaya Konopelka and Ulanok, which is to further secure the Ukrainian flank for an operation across the Sel river. Otherwise, they would risk a lot by going across the river line, with their crossings being right along the front line. We see from the footage of the fighting that the Ukrainians were geolocated to be within Fanasivka, here in the southern parts of the village, and that the Ukrainians were using M1150 mine-clearing vehicles. At the same time, there's also this footage of a Ukrainian convoy, where we can see that the distance between the vehicle that was struck and the next vehicle is very far, as we see that the Ukrainians have learned from the mistakes of the past offensive in the direction of Verdun, where this time around they are spreading their forces out, yet they are doing a large concentration of forces, in the sense that it was a longer convoy, and with the clearing of the minefields with the M1150 assault breacher, they were able to create a path to Fanasivka before the vehicle was destroyed. This allowed the Ukrainians to gain a frontline position within both of these towns. At the same time, we also see this video footage here of infantry being dropped off into the forest patches. So we see that the Ukrainians are there to stay, and that is to flank their positions near Plechovo. It is unlikely they'll push much further eastwards other than Ulanok and Ruskaya Konopelka. Instead, their objective will be focusing on the southern flank to secure Sucha and allow the Ukrainians to continue their Kursk operation. Based on the fact that we saw a M1150 assault breacher mine-clearing vehicle, it is evident that the Ukrainians were using the 47th Mechanized Brigade for this push, likely one of their mechanized battalions. And we see that the Ukrainians are spending some of the forces that they were rotating to the Kursk region following their relocation from the Pokros direction, where initially they were used to the defense of the northwestern flank to stabilize the situation and prevent a Russian breakthrough. And now they were relocated to the southern flank to launch a counterattack to regain some positions and secure the southern flank as well. And this further suggests that my theory of the Ukrainians having practically frontline soldiers with little to no training, their objective is simply to stabilize the front, while they have elite forces that move around the front line with active defense and offensive operations, where the objective is for the frontline soldiers to really just sit there and take the brunt of the fire, while the elite forces are to actually achieve some results, and they are used both for offensive and defensive operations. This has the strength of what you can see, that they are able to achieve some results through the surprise impact, and then as soon as that surprise impact is gone, they rotate to a different area, and they have already achieved their result and have taken little to no casualties. However, the issue with this strategy is that they will be extremely tired once the longer time passes by. We already saw them in the Ukrainian Summer Offensive of 2023, and since then they have constantly been in battle for a year and a half. They were then rotated to Avdiivka, following that they were now rotated to the Kursk region, so they've constantly been fighting near the front line. Moving on to the eastern section of the front line, we see that the Russians have managed to capture the village of Fyodivka. They have significantly expanded west of Novomlinsk, and they are now pushing towards the road in the northern direction to connect with their forces further east, potentially for an offensive through the border area, gain further control over the Usk River line, moving in a northern direction at the same time as they move in a southern direction. With control over Fyodivka, they will be able to move along the river line. We see that something larger is at play along the Usk River line, with the bridgehead across the Usk River line being so much larger than what was really expected. It shows that the Russians are now moving alongside the roads, but they're not moving in northwest of the Dzerzhinsk, which is the highway between the Dzerzhinsk and Vovchansk that connects further upwards. But it does connect with some larger towns alongside the border area. It is likely that the Ukrainians are operating with these three towns to operate on a wider area alongside the border area, because sending all your troops along the frontline towns and forest patches will not be very effective. It is more effective to have a command center, a center of operations, where they'll relocate their forces according to the actions of the Russian forces. Now, if the Ukrainians are flanked from the rear by Russian forces crossing over from the Usk River line, and at the same time attack from these northern directions, it will limit the Ukrainian response capabilities and spread out their forces more through a more wider assault, and this will limit the Ukrainian defensive capabilities in the area. So it could be an attempt by the Russians to expand their zone of control across the Usk River line further by an offensive operation through the northeastern outskirts of the Kharkiv region along the Russian border. But also we see that there is this road through Limandruhi towards Kamyanka and then across, which will connect at Kolodyansne, where the Russians would be able to gain control of a significant portion of the western bank of the Usk River line. And again, this would also allow them to connect with the Russian border area, where the roads are not really well connected in this area, not to the northeast, but instead it is here along the highway that moves through Prikolotne and upwards towards Vovchansk. Therefore, it will not be limited to operations here, especially in the current season, where roads are extremely important because of the difficult weather conditions. Instead, we'll likely see that the Russians will look to gain control over this area to connect with Limandruhi closer to the Russian border on the eastern bank of the Usk River line, to expand the bridgehead across the Usk River line. And then when the weather improves, they may be able to launch further operations across the border area, or they may expand to operations towards the main highway, both through the Dzerzhinsk, but also through the Kolodyansne direction, and then connect towards Prikolotne, where they'll be able to launch operations along the border area and from the Usk River bridgehead. The question is, will the Russians use the bridgehead to connect with the border area further north, or will they use it to launch offensive operations towards Kupiansk? Kupiansk is more risky, but it will give a strong enough advantage here near the Usk River line for the Russians to make significant improvements across the front line, expand the bridgehead in the southern direction, launch operations towards Shevchenkova and Kharkiv direction, and then to follow up with an operation in the north direction. Or they could do the opposite, where they launch operations northwest and northeast of the Dzerzhinsk to expand the zone of control along the border area, potentially along the highway as well. What would be even more significant is if they could connect with the Vovchansk direction. This will allow the Russians to facilitate for further offensive operations alongside the entire Kharkiv direction, both along the Usk River line, but also alongside the Sverdlovsk River line and all the way down south to Izium. So we see that the potential for extremely difficult, large-scale offensive operations is facilitated through the capture of the Dachne and the riverline area alongside the Dzerzhinsk river line, and there is potential for a significant increase in the Russian offensive capabilities in that direction, while the Ukrainian Kursk offensive operations might divert the Russian resources further, because it is evident with the success of the Ukrainians that the Russians do not really have the necessary amount of forces to completely control the situation, but instead they are keeping a minimal amount of forces to deal with the Ukrainian forces, while also taking the least amount of losses. But this also means that the Ukrainian Kursk incursion survives for a long time, as the Russians do not overwhelm their forces in the Kursk region, but it also allows Russians to advance in other sections of the front line. Although for the past few days there's been barely any updates from, well, pretty much anything other than geolocated footage, as all of these 3 advances were confirmed with geolocated footage and nothing else. We see here in the direction of Dachne, the Russians managed to capture the remaining parts of the town. With this, the Ukrainian forces there were unlikely to have withdrawn from it, and instead they were wiped out within the town, and the Russians will now be moving towards the fortified positions and then likely beyond it, before connecting their forces between Andreevka and Konstantinopel in the very western outskirts of the Khodorkovy area. And this would end the speaking of Khodorkovy and move on to, well, there's no other significant towns or settlements in the area, so it will be the southwestern Donetsk region until the Russians gain full control of that as well, alongside the Pokrovsk direction and all the way down south to the Zaporizhia region. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.